Okay, stop scrolling, because what happened in Kyiv, Ukraine this past week wasn't just a military win. It was a masterclass in calling a dictator's bluff. It showed that Putin's propaganda machine can be defeated. And it's a clear warning to every American who believes this war is slowing down or that Ukraine should simply accept whatever terms Putin demands. Here's what happened. On November 20th, Russia's chief of the General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, announced to the world that Russian forces had captured Kupiansk, a strategically vital city in Ukraine's Kharkiv region. Vladimir Putin doubled down on December 2nd, claiming Ukrainian forces in Kyiv were surrounded and even inviting journalists to come witness Russia's so-called victory. The propaganda machine went into full force. State media celebrated. Military bloggers shared triumphant posts. Putin's message was simple: Russia is winning. Ukraine is collapsing. Resistance is pointless. Then, on December 12th, Volodymyr Zelenskyy arrived in Kyiv, not in the outskirts, not in a secure zone miles away, but right at the city's entrance. Standing before a bullet-scarred city sign, surrounded by Ukrainian soldiers, he recorded a video just 500 meters from positions Russia claimed were theirs. Ukrainian forces hadn't merely held Kupiansk. They launched a counteroffensive, surrounded Russian troops inside the city, cut off their supply routes, and cleared them out block by block. Putin said Kyiv had fallen. Zelenskyy walked in and said, "Reality speaks for itself. This is what defiance looks like. This is what happens when you refuse to surrender to bullies." And this is exactly the kind of story that should make every American pause and closely examine what is truly happening in this war. But before we break down the Kupiansk operation and why it matters so deeply, let's make sure this message reaches everyone who needs to hear it. If you believe in defending democracies against dictators, if you believe facts matter more than propaganda, if you believe America should understand what its foreign policy truly supports, then smash that subscribe button right now. Hit that like button like you're hitting back against disinformation, because Putin is counting on you not paying attention. He's counting on Americans getting tired, getting bored, and getting convinced that Ukraine can't win and should just give up. The best weapon we have against that strategy is information. Real, verified, fact-based reporting from the battlefield. So let's get to work. Let's start with the tactical situation, because the details matter. Kupiansk is a city of roughly 26,000 people before the war. Located in Kharkiv Oblast in northeastern Ukraine, it sits at a critical junction of roads and railways, making it a key logistics hub. Ukraine liberated Kupiansk during its stunning September 2022 counteroffensive, when Ukrainian forces swept through the Kharkiv region, routing Russian troops and retaking thousands of square kilometers in just weeks. But Russia never gave up trying to take it back. Throughout late 2024 and into 2025, Russian forces slowly pushed across the Oskil River north of Kupiansk, gradually working their way toward the city. By September 2025, Russian units had infiltrated Kupiansk itself, using everything from underground gas pipelines to small, covert insertion teams to sneak troops into the city. The situation became critical. That's when Ukraine's military leadership made a decision that would turn a potential disaster into a stunning victory. Instead of simply trying to hold defensive positions and slowly give ground, Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrsky created a specialized search and strike group in September with a clear mission: don't just stop the Russians, push them out. The group combined some of Ukraine's best units: the National Guard's 2nd Khartia Corps, elements of the 13th Khartia Brigade, the 475th Assault Regiment known as Code 9-2, the 92nd Assault Brigade, Ukraine's Military Intelligence International Legion, and the 144th Mechanized Brigade. This wasn't a desperate last stand. This was a carefully planned combined arms operation. The Ukrainian plan unfolded in multiple phases, and watching it over the past few months shows just how sophisticated Ukraine's military planning has become. Phase 1. Air interdiction. Ukrainian F-16s, recently supplied by Western allies, began systematically striking Russian logistics. Ammunition depots, troop concentrations, and command posts were hit. When Russian forces attempted to mass for an offensive push, Ukrainian jets dropped JDAM precision-guided bombs on them. One strike near Hlybokivka caught a Russian unit mid-river crossing and annihilated it. Another hit a building in north-central Kupiansk where Russian commanders were coordinating operations. The goal wasn't just to kill Russian troops, it was to paralyze their ability to supply and reinforce forces already inside the city. Phase 2. Cutting the supply routes. Ukrainian forces identified that Russian troops were using a land corridor south of Dvorykna to infiltrate Kupiansk. Ukrainian assault teams moved through forest belts and small settlements, clearing Russian positions one by one. They liberated the villages of Rydkadub and Kindrashivka, established fire control over Halyabivka, and systematically cut off every land route the Russians were using to move supplies into Kupiansk. Russian forces had even been using an underground gas pipeline to move troops and equipment. Ukrainian forces destroyed it. By early December, Russian units inside Kupiansk were completely cut off. No land resupply, no reinforcements, only drones attempting to drop supplies to increasingly desperate soldiers. Phase 3. Encirclement and clearance. With Russian supply lines severed, Ukrainian forces tightened the noose. They cleared the northwestern outskirts of Kupiansk house by house, street by street. Russian attempts to break out or send relief forces from the east failed. Ukrainian commanders had anticipated these moves and positioned strong blocking forces in advance. According to Khartia Corps Commander Yevgeny Zelenskyy, the Russian troops inside the city were completely isolated. For a long time, they didn't understand what was happening, he said. Now they know they are surrounded. As of mid-December, only around 200 Russian soldiers remained in isolated pockets in central Kupiansk, being systematically hunted down. The numbers tell the story. Since September, Ukrainian forces in the Kupiansk sector have killed over 1,027 Russian servicemen, wounded 291, and captured 13 prisoners. Ukrainian troops retook multiple villages, cleared most of the city, and established complete fire control over remaining Russian positions. And they did all of this while Russia was publicly claiming victory, while Vladimir Putin was inviting journalists to tour what he claimed was a captured city. Which brings us to President Volodymyr Zelenskyy's visit on December 12th. This wasn't a photo op. It was a calculated political and strategic message. Zelenskyy recorded his video at the entrance to Kupiansk, well within range of Russian drones and artillery. He visited command posts, met directly with frontline soldiers, and made it unmistakably clear that Ukraine had not only held Kupiansk, but had turned it into a graveyard for Russian ambitions. And he explicitly connected battlefield success to diplomatic leverage. Today, achieving results on the front line is crucial, Zelenskyy said, so that Ukraine can achieve results in diplomacy. That's how it works. Strong positions inside the country mean strong positions at the negotiating table. Now let's talk about why this matters beyond just one city. Because Kupiansk isn't happening in isolation. It's part of a broader pattern that completely contradicts the narrative Putin wants you to believe. Putin claims Russia is winning. He claims Russian forces have the initiative across the entire front. He demands more territory and threatens to take it by force if diplomacy doesn't give him what he wants. And then Ukrainian forces execute operations like Kupiansk that expose those claims as lies. Yes, Russia has made territorial gains in 2025. They've taken parts of Pokrovsk. They've ground forward in the Donbass at enormous cost. Putin loves to boast about liberating hundreds of settlements. But look at what those gains actually mean. The Institute for the Study of War, one of the most respected independent military analysis organizations in the world, estimates that at Russia's current rate of advance, it would take until August 2027 just to fully capture the Donetsk region. That's more than 2 additional years of catastrophic World War I-style attritional warfare to seize a single region. And that estimate assumes Russia can sustain its current losses indefinitely, which is far from certain. Meanwhile, Ukraine continues to demonstrate that it can not only defend, but counterattack successfully, when given the resources and opportunity. Kupiansk is the most dramatic recent example. But it's not the only one. Ukrainian forces have carried out successful limited counterattacks near Lyman, maintaining pressure on Russian units there. Ukrainian drones continue striking deep into Russian territory, hitting oil refineries, military installations, and even Moscow itself, including a single night involving over 130 drones. Ukraine's naval drones have destroyed 5 Russian warships in 2025 alone, forcing the remainder of Russia's Black Sea Fleet to relocate from Crimea to mainland Russian ports. And Ukraine still holds Russian territory in Kursk Oblast, 16 months after its stunning August 2024 cross-border offensive. This is not what a losing side looks like. This is what a military that is adapting, innovating, and finding ways to win, despite being outmanned and often outgunned, actually looks like. Which raises a critical question every American should be asking. If Ukraine is performing this well, why is the Trump administration pushing so aggressively for Ukraine to accept territorial concessions and a weak peace deal? Because here's what's been happening behind the scenes. While Ukrainian forces were retaking Kupiansk, the Trump administration has been negotiating with Russia on a peace framework that, according to multiple leaks, would pressure Ukraine to cede significant territory, accept permanent limits on its military, and leave itself vulnerable to future Russian aggression. The original proposal reportedly contained 28 points, many of them aligned with Russian demands. After Ukrainian and European pushback, it has reportedly been reduced to 19 points. But serious concerns remain about what concessions Ukraine is being asked, or forced, to make. And here's the part that should alarm every American. The Trump administration is using Russia's territorial gains as justification for pressuring Ukraine. The argument goes like this: Russia is advancing. Ukraine is losing ground. The situation is hopeless. So Ukraine should take the best deal it can now, before things get worse. Kupiansk exposes that narrative as fundamentally flawed. Yes, Russia gains ground in some areas. But Ukraine can, and does, push back successfully when it has the support and resources to do so. The question isn't whether Ukraine can fight. The question is whether the United States and Europe will give Ukraine what it needs to continue fighting effectively. And that brings us directly to the American people. Because what happens in Ukraine matters to American security and American values in ways that go far beyond this one war. Let's be brutally honest about what's at stake. Vladimir Putin launched an unprovoked war of conquest against a sovereign democracy. He did it because he believed Ukraine wasn't really a nation, that the West wouldn't fight for it, and that Russia could absorb it with minimal consequences. He was wrong. But he hasn't stopped. He's demanding not only the territory Russia currently occupies, but territory it doesn't even control. And he's threatening to take it by force if diplomacy doesn't give him what he wants. So ask yourself this: if the United States pressures Ukraine to accept these demands, what message does that send to every dictator on earth? It tells them that if you kill enough people, destroy enough cities, and threaten nuclear weapons loudly enough, democracies will eventually get tired and let you keep your conquests. It tells China that Taiwan is there for the taking. It tells Iran that aggression pays. It tells every would-be authoritarian that the so-called rules-based international order collapses the moment it's seriously challenged. And this isn't just about sending messages. It's about cold, hard strategic interests. Europe is America's most important alliance network. A weak, divided, intimidated Europe is bad for American security and prosperity. A Europe where borders can be redrawn by force, where Putin's imperial ambitions are rewarded, is a Europe that will be perpetually unstable, perpetually vulnerable, and perpetually more expensive for America to defend. Now compare that to a Europe where aggression fails, where Ukraine emerges as a strong, Western-oriented democracy, where Putin's gamble collapses, and where future aggressors think twice. Which Europe better serves American interests? That's why Kupiansk matters. It's a data point that shatters the defeatist narrative. It proves Ukraine can win battles when properly supported. It demonstrates creativity, determination, and operational sophistication. And it exposes Russian claims of inevitable victory for what they really are: propaganda. And it should force Americans to ask why their government seems so eager to push Ukraine into a bad peace deal instead of helping Ukraine secure a just peace through strength. Now let's talk about what Ukraine actually needs, and why Americans should care whether it gets it. Ukrainian forces are performing remarkably well, but under severe constraints. Ammunition shortages remain constant. Artillery shells, air defense interceptors, long-range strike weapons. Ukraine needs all of them in far greater quantities than it's currently receiving. The Kupiansk operation succeeded in part because Ukraine concentrated resources there, but that meant those resources couldn't be used elsewhere. Every decision is a trade-off between defending one sector and risking another. Manpower is another critical challenge. Ukraine has been fighting for nearly 4 years. Its forces are exhausted. Mobilization has been extensive and controversial. The country must expand its military while keeping its economy functioning and its society intact. Functioning. Western training programs help, but they take time. Meanwhile, Russia can draw on a much larger population and has shown it's willing to absorb casualties that would be politically suicidal in any democracy. But here's the crucial point. These constraints are solvable if the West chooses to solve them. Ukraine doesn't need American troops fighting on its soil. It needs weapons, ammunition, equipment, and sustained economic support. The cost to the United States is a fraction of what America already spends on defense. And the strategic return, defeating Russian aggression without risking American lives, is enormous. Now let's address the elephant in the room. The argument that America should cut its losses. That Ukraine is a forever war. That we should focus on problems at home instead of spending money overseas. It sounds appealing on the surface, but it's strategically illiterate. First, the money spent on Ukraine is not cash wired to Kyiv. Most of it is spent inside the United States, in American factories, employing American workers, producing weapons that replace old U.S. stockpiles with modern equipment. It's effectively an American jobs program that also happens to degrade one of America's primary adversaries. Second, the alternative to supporting Ukraine is not peace. It's a bigger, worse war later. If Putin wins in Ukraine, he won't stop. He's already talking about historical lands that include NATO members. The choice isn't between supporting Ukraine now or avoiding war altogether. The choice is between stopping Russian aggression in Ukraine or stopping it later, possibly with American troops in Poland or the Baltics. Third, and this is critical, pulling back from Ukraine doesn't free resources for domestic priorities. It creates new problems that cost far more to fix. A victorious, emboldened Russia would spend the next decade destabilizing Europe, forcing the United States to spend vastly more on European defense. A China watching America abandon Ukraine would feel far more confident moving on Taiwan, potentially triggering a conflict that would make Ukraine look small by comparison. A world where aggression pays is a world where America faces constant, expensive crises. Supporting Ukraine now is the cheap option. Dealing with the consequences of letting Putin win is the expensive one. So that brings us to the most important question. What should America do? And here I want to speak directly to the American public, especially those who are skeptical about supporting Ukraine or who wonder why any of this matters. You have a right, actually a responsibility, to demand that American foreign policy serves American interests. So let's be clear about what those interests are. America has an interest in defeating authoritarian aggression without fighting directly. Ukraine is doing that. America has an interest in a stable, prosperous, democratic Europe. Ukraine's victory supports that. America has an interest in deterring China, Iran, and other adversaries. Letting Russia fail in Ukraine sends that message. America has an interest in preserving the principle that borders cannot be changed by force. Ukraine is fighting for that principle right now. So what does supporting those interests look like in practice? It means continuing and accelerating military aid to Ukraine. Not just enough to survive, but enough to win. It means long-range weapons that allow Ukraine to strike Russian logistics and command centers. It means air defense systems that protect Ukrainian cities and infrastructure. It means artillery ammunition in quantities that meet or exceed Russian fire rates. It means economic support that keeps Ukraine's economy functioning during wartime. And critically, it means ironclad security guarantees, so any future Russian aggression triggers an overwhelming Western response. It also means resisting pressure to force Ukraine into a bad peace deal. And this is where Americans need to pay very close attention to what the Trump administration is doing, because there is a real risk that Ukraine will be pressured into accepting terms that lock in Russian gains, leave Ukraine vulnerable, and guarantee another war in a few years. That isn't peace. That's a pause, so Russia can regroup and attack again. Real peace requires Russia to understand that aggression fails, that territorial conquest will be reversed, and that Ukraine will emerge strong enough to deter future attacks. The Kupiansk operation proves this is possible. Ukrainian forces, when properly equipped and supported, can defeat Russian troops on the battlefield. They can retake ground. They can turn Putin's propaganda victories into humiliating defeats. But they can only do it if the West stays committed. And in this context, the West means primarily the United States, because like it or not, American leadership determines whether Europe stays united and whether Ukraine gets what it needs. So here's my message to the American people. Don't let fatigue or propaganda convince you this war is unwinnable, or that Ukraine should just give up. Kupiansk proves otherwise. Don't let politicians tell you that supporting Ukraine is wasteful or pointless. Every dollar spent degrading Russia's military power today prevents far more costly conflicts tomorrow. And don't let anyone tell you this doesn't matter for America. It matters enormously. Because the real question isn't whether America can afford to support Ukraine. It's whether America can afford not to. Not to. Putin is betting that democracies are weak. That Americans have short attention spans. That you'll get bored, tired, or convinced that Ukraine isn't worth the cost. Kupiansk should be the answer to that bet. It's a reminder that Ukrainian forces aren't just fighting for their own country. They're fighting for a principle that matters to every democracy, that aggression doesn't pay, that borders matter, and that might does not make right. And they're not just surviving. They're winning battles that should inspire confidence, not defeatism. But they can only win this war if America stays committed, if support keeps flowing, if sanctions stay in place, and if the message to Putin remains unmistakably clear: you will not be rewarded for this aggression. The alternative, a Russian victory achieved through Western exhaustion, is a nightmare scenario for global security. It would be the most serious strategic failure since Hitler seized the Sudetenland, while Britain and France convinced themselves that appeasement would bring peace. We know how that turned out. So pay attention to Kupiansk. Pay attention to what Ukrainian forces are achieving when properly supported, and demand that your government not throw it away by pressuring Ukraine into a bad peace deal. Because what happens in Ukraine doesn't stay in Ukraine. It sets precedents. It sends messages. It shapes the world your children will inherit. And the message America should be sending is simple: aggression doesn't pay. Democracies don't fold. And bullies don't get to win just because they're willing to kill more people than anyone thought possible. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy stood in Kupiansk and said, "The reality speaks for itself. The reality is that Ukraine is fighting brilliantly against enormous odds. The reality is that Ukrainian forces can win battles when given the tools to do so. The reality is that Putin's narrative of inevitable Russian victory is propaganda, not prophecy. And the reality is this: America has the power to determine whether this war ends with a Ukrainian victory that secures peace, or a Russian success that guarantees future wars. That's not a decision that should be made in back rooms. That's a decision the American people should make, informed by facts, not propaganda. So make it count. Share this video. Demand better from your leaders. And remember what's actually happening on the battlefields of Ukraine, because it matters more than you might think.